everyone, and welcome to the Nature-Based Solutions anchoring event of the Climate Adaptation Summit. My name is Elizabeth Shirt, and I'll be your MC for the next 2 hours. I'm the Managing Director of Globe Series, and my organization had the privilege of supporting the governments of Canada and Mexico in organizing today's event. Today's event is trilingual, and you're able to listen in English, Spanish, and French. At the bottom of the screen, there's a language button. Look for the globe logo that enables you to listen in the language of your choice. We've got an incredible lineup of esteemed speakers for you today, including ministers, Indigenous leaders, and private executives from around the world. However, before we begin, I believe it's important to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Canada, from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, also known as Vancouver. I'd encourage you to take a moment and consider your connection to the land from which you're joining our event today. And in that spirit, please feel free to reply to the poll appearing to the left of my face just now to share with us the area of the world that you're joining from. Today's event will give you insights into actions and outcomes that the Nature-Based Solutions Action Track has advanced during the Global Commission on Adaptation's Year of Action under the leadership of Action Track co-leads Canada and Mexico and their partners. We hope they inspire you to take action. You'll hear first from our co-hosts of this anchoring event, Canada and Mexico, and then from high-level international leaders who will discuss 3 key areas of action that Action Track members identified over the last year: Indigenous leadership, local leadership, and financing of nature-based solutions. On that note of action, we'd like to encourage you to use the chat function to share your ideas and comments and the actions you are taking to advance nature-based solutions for adaptation in your communities. And we encourage you to share your ideas with us throughout the event. If you have something to share, please turn on your chat, add that to the chat comments, and we can't wait to hear from you. And of course, all languages are welcome. It's now my pleasure to introduce our lineup of opening speakers. In just a moment, you'll hear from the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Environment and Climate Change of the Government of Canada. Next, we'll be joined by Dr. Maria Amparo Martinez Arroyo, Head of Mexico's National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change. You'll also hear opening remarks from Dr. Patrick Vercoyen, Chief Executive Officer of the Global Center on Adaptation, and from Ms. Inger Anderson, Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome the co-lead of the Nature-Based Solutions Action Track of the Global Commission on Adaptation, the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Environment and Climate Change of the Government of Canada. Let's hear Minister Wilkinson's remarks.
Good morning. I am delighted to join you from North Vancouver, which is located on the traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. It is certainly a difficult time with the global community continuing to be severely afflicted by the impacts of the pandemic. But as you know, the impacts of the existential crises that loom on the horizon, that of climate change and rapid biodiversity loss, are expected to be even more far-reaching, and they are already being felt worldwide. That is why last month, Prime Minister Trudeau announced Canada's strengthened climate plan, a healthy environment and a healthy economy, a proposed plan to achieve Canada's environmental goals and our economic hopes: clean air, clean water, and long-term secure jobs. With this plan, Canadians will exceed our 2030 greenhouse gas emissions targets under the Paris Agreement. We will establish the building blocks to achieve net zero by 2050, and we will create long-term and sustainable communities in every region of this country. This plan recognizes the fundamental link between nature, a stable climate, human well-being, and sustainable development. It aims to embrace the power of nature to cut pollution, clean our air, and make communities more resilient to extreme weather. Nature-based solutions are an important part of Canada's approach to fighting and adapting to climate change. They can play an important role in the ambitious and concerted action we need to accelerate in terms of global adaptation. Canada is a resolute participant and champion of the Global Commission on Adaptation. Early in its work, the Commission recognized that nature must be an integral part of adaptation strategies because it provides vital and irreplaceable protection against the mounting impacts of climate change. That is why Canada has co-led with Mexico the Nature-Based Solutions Action Track. Nature-based climate solutions are cost-effective and they provide multiple co-benefits for economies, communities, culture, health, and nature. Facilitating the uptake of nature-based solutions is central to the Government of Canada's Climate Action Strategy. We have embedded natural infrastructure as a high-priority eligibility consideration for programs such as our Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, which supports resilient amenities, services, and systems. We continue to see enhanced effectiveness in our adaptation initiatives through our commitment to work with Indigenous peoples as full and effective partners in addressing biodiversity loss and climate change. The Adage Indigenous Protected Area is a great example of this. It is the first Indigenous protected and conserved area established under the Canada Nature Fund, encompassing an area of over 14,000 square kilometers. Today's event will illustrate the achievements of the Nature-Based Solutions Action Track. We have worked to demonstrate the potential of nature-based solutions at scale in an effort to inspire their uptake. The Action Track has profiled through virtual events the achievements of 5 Vanguard countries: Peru, Canada, Mexico, Ethiopia, and the Netherlands, in implementing nature-based solutions, bringing much-needed attention to nature's largely untapped role in adaptation. The Action Track has also profiled cities, youth, Indigenous peoples, countries, and private sector leadership in nature-based solutions. These virtual events drew in more than 2,000 participants worldwide. In today's event, we will share some of the key learnings from our work with you. You will learn about existing nature-based solutions led by Indigenous peoples, youth, cities, and local communities that are building resilience to climate change. You will also hear how 5 innovative financing models are breaking down barriers to financing nature-based solutions. And we will focus in on how to further mobilize private and public sector investments for nature-based solutions and enhance their effectiveness to accelerate scale-up. 2021 will be a critical year for global environmental cooperation on climate change and biodiversity, with high expectations for significantly more ambition on both issues. This year, our efforts to advance nature-based solutions will be enhanced by the COP26 campaign on adaptation and resilience. I very much want to extend my sincere thanks to Canada's Action Track partners, the Government of Mexico, the Global Centre on Adaptation, the Global Environmental Facility, the United Nations Environment Programme, and the World Resources Institute for their inspiring work under the Action Track. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Minister Wilkinson. I'd now like to pass the virtual mic over to Dr. Maria Amparo Martinez Arroyo, head of Mexico's National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change, to provide some framing comments. Over to you, Dr. Martinez Arroyo.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of the Government of Mexico, I'd like to thank all the participants for their presence at this event, part of the larger Global Adaptation Summit, which I am very enthusiastic about. Of course, we thank the Government of Canada and all the representatives of national and subnational governments, multilateral organizations, and social organizations for their commitment to developing different actions and action plans to fight climate change. Plans that are based on the management and restoration of natural ecosystems. Climate change is a systemic problem of our civilization and requires cross-cutting and concerted global action. The nature-based solutions approach addresses the crucial links between climate change, biodiversity, desertification, disasters, sustainable management of natural resources, also scientific knowledge, traditional knowledge, social participation, land justice, environmental justice, and gender equity, among other elements, and therefore it brings about multiple benefits. Nature-based adaptation can help reduce emissions and increase carbon sinks. It can help improve food security, reduce risks, and create a healthy environment. And it is, in a way, an approach that can be used in countries with very different levels of income. When the three major environmental conventions were created in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, we already knew at the time that reversing the most negative impacts of human activity on nature and the environment would require consistent global action. However, 50 years later, we are able to see that we have not done enough to avoid the risks that now threaten all the countries of the world. Of course, we have made progress in terms of knowledge, awareness, and social participation in many countries. We have achieved some success with international actions such as the Montreal Protocol, and we have reached historic agreements such as the Paris Accord and the 2030 Agenda. Nevertheless, the impacts of global climate change are not homogeneous. They are differentiated between countries, between regions, within countries, and also within generations. Nor are these impacts equitable. There are disproportionate economic risks for low-income countries and for social groups with the fewest resources within countries. However, no country can feel safe from global impacts. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a universal shock that reminds us how intertwined our lives, our societies, our economy, and our health are with what happens in nature, other living creatures, and other human beings. The pandemic was, in a way, a small glimpse of the kind of global problems that are projected for climate change. In this context, nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation now represent an extraordinary opportunity to take action in all corners of the globe, all at the same time in an inclusive, comprehensive, and transformative manner. And they can be an integral part of the path to intelligent post-pandemic recovery. Mexico, in updating its nationally determined contributions in 2020, is highlighting the importance of nature-based solutions for both adaptation and mitigation. For example, Mexico is incorporating we are taking actions to ensure the health of the population, food security, and biological and cultural diversity. We trust that at this event we will be able to learn about the work done over the last year and strengthen the participation of all countries in this area as we near COP26. And we hope that we can build a more sustainable and fair world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez Arroyo, for your remarks, for reminding us of the cross-cutting and interconnected need for global action, that climate change is a complex and multidimensional challenge. But as we look to address climate change through nature-based solutions, there are multiple benefits, as well as reminding us that the impacts of climate change are not homogeneous or equitable. These are important threads that we'll be picking up on through the rest of the event. It's my pleasure next to introduce Dr. Patrick Verkooyen, Chief Executive Officer of the Global Center on Adaptation, to provide opening remarks. Let's hear now from Dr. Verkooyen.
The world has ushered in an era of multiple interconnected systemic shocks. And if the last 12 months during the pandemic has taught us anything, it is that we have to heal nature, to heal ourselves. Because nature also helps us to fight climate change and protects us from its worst effects. That is why the Global Center on Adaptation, the GCA, has been so keen to work with the government of Canada and Mexico, along with the Global Environment Facility, the World Resources Institute, and UNEP, and many other partners, to transform the global agenda for nature-based solutions, NBS, into concrete action. Because let us not forget, there is a compelling economic case for action. The Global Commission on Adaptation, which is sunsetting today, found that every dollar invested in NBS can generate up to $10 of benefits. But this agenda is not just about economic benefits. Protecting and enhancing the natural environment is also vital from a social perspective, given that over 1.2 billion people rely upon healthy ecosystems for their livelihoods. There are many examples of nature-based solutions, and many of which are being discussed today. Yet, globally, there remains a huge untapped potential to use nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation. Currently, few nationally determined contributions, NDCs, fully exploit the potential of nature for adaptation. And in the private sector, only 3% of nearly 2,000 companies reported using natural ecosystems as part of their climate adaptation strategies. Our efforts during the year of action provided a strong foundation for the needed efforts to scale up NBS. We at the Global Center on Adaptation will now take that forward in our NBS for Infrastructure program in close collaboration with all of you. I would like to thank the Vanguard countries and cities profiled today. We have provided the inspiration for our ongoing efforts to achieve large-scale NBS. This is a critical year for NBS when we build forward from the COVID crisis, because the truth is, we need nature more than it needs us. And if we are to build a new, more resilient post-COVID world, our global macroeconomic and financial system must begin to value nature. If we can work with nature rather than against it, we will be building a more solid foundation for human well-being and environmental and economic health, not just for today, but for generations to come. The world.
Thank you, Dr. Verkooyen. Powerful message. And thank you for reminding us that in the wake of the global pandemic, healing nature is a critical piece of how nations can look to heal themselves, and that scaling solutions can unlock incredible untapped economic and social benefits. Up next, I'm thrilled to introduce the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program, Ms. Inger Andersen, joining us from Denmark. Ms. Andersen, over to you.
Well, thank you. And let me start by thanking and expressing warm thanks to the governments of Canada and Mexico for organizing this event and for co-leading the Adaptation Nature-Based Solutions track, which is really great. As we've heard, we are not doing enough. And it is the poor who suffer the most, because even if we limit global warming to 2 degrees or we get even to 1.5, the poorest and the most vulnerable will be those that bear the brunt of our inaction. And that is an issue that we need to recall. The World Bank already 2 years ago came out with a report that told us that 100 million people were at risk to fall into poverty if we did not take in sufficient climate action. And of course, we know that this will have worsened by the pandemic. So action and using all tools in our toolbox is what matters. And here, let us recall the Paris Agreement, Article 9, Paragraph 4, to get specific. In the Paris Agreement, we undertook to keep scaled up finance in balance between adaptation and mitigation, but we have not lived up to our promise. In a report that we came out with, the Adaptation Gap report we came out with last month, we show that we are far behind and we are still in the early stages of implementation, and that we need a lot more action to ensure that adaptation is properly funded. So let me just mention 3 areas where we need to see all countries and all leaders and all communities step up. First, financing. We have to live up to what we promised in Paris. It's as simple as that. Adaptation finance remains at about 5% of global finance for climate change. That is not acceptable. So we need to see more money pledged before and at COP26 in line with the promise. Secondly, the stimulus packages that we are now rolling off the budgets, let's make sure that they do not just go to getting us back to where we were. Use these smartly, precisely to invest in nature-based solutions. That would be the way forward. And use public-private partnerships so that we can have the public funding prime the pump pump for private sector funding coming after, using regulatory and incentive settings. So that's the first thing, get financing in place. Secondly, a much stronger focus on NBS, nature-based solutions, in the national determined contributions. These need to be submitted to COP26. Let's make sure that we actually pressure and ensure that nature-based solutions are referenced. Today, only about 17% of the NDCs that are submitted have quantifiable targets for NDCs, for nature-based solutions. We need to do much better than that. And my third topic is that we need to unite the nature-based solutions agenda and the climate agenda. Let's recall that IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, defines nature-based solutions as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural ecosystems to address societal challenges, including climate change, for the benefits of people as well as biodiversity. So this is not only about climate change. It is about investing in nature, protecting nature so that it can protect us. And here the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, which starts this year, is a wonderful example to bring together the three Rio conventions: climate change, land degradation, desertification, and obviously biodiversity, because nature's infrastructure, that bottom line is that nature's infrastructure, and investing in that, in our estuaries, our mangroves, our coastal forests, our waterways, our flowering meadows, our kelp forests, that beautiful landscape that we have, investing in that makes sense. Because when we invest in that, we invest in our own future, we invest in biodiversity. It's good for the climate, it's good for us, and it's good for planetary health. And Indigenous people teach us this. So I look forward to hearing from the Indigenous voices today. NBS, nature-based solutions in the NDCs, will give these multiple returns, but it will also give a return for a strong COP15, ensuring that we get an ambitious post-2020 agreement. So we have to do all of this because we live in this world that is both vulnerable and unequal. So we can't afford to lose the race. We must ensure that we protect the poor and hear all voices as we do so. Thank you very much once more. I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Thank you for reminding us that we need to commit to act equally on both mitigation and adaptation. Absolutely critical. And we'll be talking a lot more later in the event about attracting finance and private-public partnerships in order to really see nature-based solutions advanced. It's also clear from your remarks that nature-based solutions truly must be global solutions. And on that note, I want to turn to the results of our first poll. I'm thrilled to report that today we have participants joining from all over the world: Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, Central and South America. So exciting to see the engagement of participants from literally all around the world. I do want to let you know that in order to use the interpretation, I'll encourage you just to refresh your browsers such that you can use that globe icon and turn on the interpretation if you choose to listen to the event in a language, either English, French, or Spanish, as our speakers are speaking. You can also turn the chat window on and off using the button above the session window if you find it distracting, or you want to turn it on to leave a remark. On that note, I would like to dig a little bit deeper into who we have on the line today with our next poll. So I just encourage you to take a moment to respond to this second poll that's appearing on the screen beside me regarding which sector you feel that you represent. As you're entering into your responses, we'll move to a deeper dive discussion on Indigenous and local leadership, starting first with Indigenous leaders from Canada, Mexico, and Kenya. Indigenous peoples have long been leaders in environmental stewardship, sustainable development, and the management of natural resources on their lands. The members of the Nature-Based Solutions Action Track engaged with representatives of Indigenous peoples throughout the year of action because they understand that Indigenous knowledge, rights, and leadership must play a foundational role as we work to identify challenges and opportunities for scaling up nature-based solutions for adaptation. For example, Indigenous women have a key role as keepers and caretakers of irreplaceable knowledge developed over millennia that they help to transmit to the next generation of young Indigenous leaders. During the Year of Action, the government of Mexico organized a multi-part Indigenous peoples dialogue on climate change, biodiversity, and desertification. The dialogue highlighted the enormous potential of Indigenous-led initiatives to bring together nature-based solutions and climate action, and the importance of respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and their knowledge in implementing nature-based solutions. And so now, to share their insights with us, I'd like to welcome to your screens Mr. Adolfo Regino Montes, head of the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples of Mexico, Deputy Grand Chief and Vice Chairperson of the Grand Council of the Cree Nation, Mandigo, who is a member of the Cree First Nation EU and is joining us from Canada, and Ms. Lucy Mulenke, Executive Director of the Indigenous Information Network and board member of the Natural Justice Network. She is part of the Maasai tribe and is joining us from Kenya. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Regino Montes. Could you please share with us some of the key messages that we learned from the Indigenous Peoples Dialogue and talk a little bit about what comes next?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, dear Elizabeth, for giving me the floor. Welcome in his Indigenous language. It's a real honour for us to participate in this anchoring event on nature-based solutions. And as you've correctly already said, Elizabeth, we need to recognise the key role played by Indigenous peoples in this work on nature-based solutions. And we've been promoting global dialogue to listen to the different opinions on this matter. And as you've said, last year, the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples and the Mexican Secretariat of Foreign Affairs, together with the support of the Government of Canada and the WRI, the World Resources Institute, we organised together the Indigenous Peoples Dialogue on climate change, biodiversity, and desertification. We held 9 working sessions on the 22nd and 29th of September and the 6th and 13th of October. And we had participation from representatives from Indigenous peoples from throughout the world, including representatives from the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and also the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform of the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I'd like to underline the support of the 3 Rio Convention Secretariats, the UN Convention on Biodiversity, and also the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and once again, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So one of the first statements that we derived on a consensus basis as a result of this dialogue was the affirmation from the Indigenous peoples representatives that it's not a matter of exerting control over nature, but rather we need to live in harmony with nature. Another statement was that Indigenous peoples have continued to follow the original guidance and teachings of their ancestors. And the main component therein is that we should accept and honour our relationship with every form of life and also all the elements that do not appear to be alive, but namely, they represent the whole of creation throughout the universe. This is a basic component that human beings have unfortunately forgotten, and that is why we now find ourselves in this very critical moment with COVID-19 affecting the whole of humanity. So the main conclusions that came out of this dialogue process are the following. First of all, for Indigenous peoples, all solutions are nature-based and should be based in nature. And these are types of practical knowledge that our people have been pursuing since time immemorial because of their intrinsic material and spiritual relationship with Mother Earth. A second conclusion is the following, namely, nature-based solutions should always be respectful of Indigenous peoples' rights, and that should be the basis for discussions in different fora, including participation of Indigenous peoples, and should accept their governance and their knowledge. Then thirdly, implementation of nature-based solutions must actually be context-specific. Nature should not be separated from culture. It should be seen in an integral way. Then another very important point for us is that Indigenous traditional knowledge must be considered as an integral element of these solutions. And another aspect that's been highlighted by the Indigenous peoples' representatives is the question of land tenure and production rights. These are some of the rights that need to be integrated into the nature-based solutions, and so there needs to be respectful forms of collaboration sought with all the stakeholders. Finally, Elizabeth, our sisters and brothers, or Indigenous sisters and brothers, have affirmed that it must be recognised that ecosystem restoration requires a cultural and spiritual connection, applying a human rights-based approach, since there is no division between culture and nature, nor should any culture be allowed to have mastery and dominion over nature. These are the important conclusions that we are sharing with you from this dialogue, and we wish these to be shared in the negotiation process at an international level that's underway, and we know that this can feed into the whole reflection process and the agreements to be reached drawing on nature-based solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Regino Montes. Amazing remarks and fantastic principles and learnings from that year of action and from the People's Dialogue that you hosted. I want to shift now to Deputy Grand Chief Gull and Ms. Mullinkay to hear some examples of how learnings like these are being put into practice. Deputy Grand Chief Gull, I'll start with you. From your experience working on Indigenous protected and conserved areas in Canada, could you share with us how and why Indigenous-led nature-based solutions are critical to building resilience to climate change impacts? And I'll ask you to try to respond to that massive question in just 3 minutes or so. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jinskum. Nishtam gan gino yemen we wate na askedi edian gan yemo. Jinskum odm shawenjis kabedwi sandoje jidan otn haunjis. I just wanted to speak my Cree language. Before I start, it's important to showcase that we still have a very strong connection to our culture and our language. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd first like to thank everybody for inviting me to have the opportunity to showcase the work that we've been doing. My name is Mandy Gall. I'm from the Cree Nation of Iwishji in northern Quebec. I think I'm going to be echoing some of the sentiments of our previous speaker, and I would like to highlight that the work that we have done here in northern Quebec in Iwishji is based on one critical element for the Cree Nation, and that's culture. Culture, culture, culture. I cannot overemphasize the importance of culture. We are the Cree Nation. We have an incredibly large territory. Our traditional territories are over 400 square kilometers in northern Quebec, very significant space. And over the past 15 years, we've been working on ensuring that we have continued levels of protection legislated within our region. It's been a massive undertaking, and this year we were really excited to highlight the protection of 20% of ESG. And this means complete highest level of protection that's been identified with our partners of the Quebec government and federal government as well. One of the things that we did in undertaking this project many years back was really ensuring that the areas that we protected highlighted significant zones of culture. So we have people that continue to live on the territory who are full-time hunters and trappers. They have a very close relationship with the territory. We gathered information through data collection in focus groups and speaking directly to tallyman and land users. We also ensured that in collaboration with our partnership with Quebec, we also collected information regarding their target of biodiversity. We were able to interweave the two sets of data together, also highlighting target areas of information, looking at shifts in climate, the impact of forest fire, water types, various types of landscape. And we put all of this information together, and we were able to select key areas of protection for ESG. The thing that was interesting was the traditional information collected on the Cree side highlighted almost entirely the same biodiversity target areas that Quebec had chosen. So culture and traditional knowledge go hand in hand because it is based on an extensive relationship that's interwoven with the existence of our territory. We set aside a massive portion of our territory. It was over 100,000 square kilometers, the size of Iceland. So it was really a pleasure to put this file together to highlight the importance of culture. When you save the territory, when you protect the territory, and you work hand in hand with First Nations, you're also guaranteeing the future of that First Nations group.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Deputy Grand Chief Gull. Ms. Malenke, can you discuss some of the unique and diverse challenges or opportunities for Indigenous communities in implementing nature-based solutions in Kenya? And I'll ask you to do your best to, again, answer that huge question in just 3 minutes or so.
Yes, I will try my best to do that. And I just want to say that looking at the nature-based solutions, that's what actually most of the Indigenous communities survive on, and that is what they embrace, because we know that is the best way to live sustainably and to manage all their resources. And Indigenous women, especially because we've already mentioned about them, whom we work a lot with them, have already had very good innovations in terms of looking at the nature-based solutions, collecting seeds, making sure that they have indigenous vegetation, indigenous food, indigenous trees and fruits to be able to feed their families. And at the same time, to look at issues of medicine. And this is something that we really have been discussing for a long time. The only other challenge that they've been having is that in terms of recognition on productive resources, the right to the production resources that they have is still a big challenge. And it's still a big challenge in most of the African countries that women don't own land. They cannot be able to actually own their land to be able to produce and be able to feed their families and so on. So we still have also a challenge of understanding those land laws and others, and the implementation of the governments being able to do that so that the communities can be equally included, both in decision making and also to give ideas, because the innovations they have, the traditional knowledge they have, is really something that is important for them, is something that can also be able to help science. This is something that has also been able to help the Indigenous communities to adapt to climate change, to protect their biodiversity, and also to be able to face a lot of other challenges that they experience in their own ways. In my country, for example, 80% is dry lands. So you can imagine that most of those Indigenous communities, remote local communities, are in areas where it's really a challenge in terms of climate change. But they try as much as possible to innovate and to be able to manage that. But as I said, there are those challenges that are still there. that need support. Because no matter what we do to protect our biodiversity, to adapt to climate change, we need each other. We need a human rights approach. And we need the governments to recognize the rights of these indigenous peoples and the rights of women to own their land and to be also voices in the decision-making level. So these are some of the things, Elizabeth, most of the people have already discussed and brought them, and the ones we also discussed last year during the meeting with Mexico and Canada and other key stakeholders. Indigenous people continue participating and trying to bring their voices on the table so that we can be able to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Malenkeh, and to all three of our panelists for those responses. I have the privilege now to introduce two new panelists to our session here, two very active local leaders in nature-based solutions. Mr. Opeyemi Elujalo, Director of Youth for the Environment in Nigeria and a Global Ambassador for the organization Youth for Nature, and Mr. Henk Nieboer, President of EcoShape and joining us from the Netherlands. So thank you both for joining us today. There's just a little bit of noise, background noise, so maybe I'll invite you to just mute your lines until we get to the questions. Before we move deeper into discussion on local leadership, though, we have a great opportunity to take a question for both our Indigenous and local leaders from Ms. Sofia Molina, a young Mexican activist for children's environmental rights. After we hear from Ms. Molina, each speaker will have about a minute or two to respond. So I'll hand it over to Ms. Molina to please ask your question.
In the next dialogue space in this event, leaders, business people, and international organizations will be discussing the importance of financing NBS projects. In your opinion, what needs to be done so that leaders like you can accelerate economic support and thus scale up the impact of such projects in your communities?
Thank you for that, Sophia. So Sophia notes that later in the event, she understands we'll hear from governments, business people, and international organizations about the importance of financing nature-based solutions projects. And so to our panelists, I'm wondering, in your opinion, what should be done so that leaders like you can access economic support and scale up the impacts of nature-based solutions projects in your communities? And Ms. Malenkeh, I'd love to start with you, just 1 or 2 minutes on what do you think can be done to help leaders like yourself access economic support and scale up projects in your communities?
I think one of the key issues is to make sure that most of the work that we do is recognized. And again, there is the issue that was brought up about finance, because we try as much as possible also as who are working with the communities to also work with the communities and to support them. And without finance and without environmental friendly will from the government, politically supported from the government, is also very crucial, not only to me alone, but also to different communities. This is very crucial for making sure that we are able to do our work and also to be able to ensure that there is financial support.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Elujalo, I'm going to go next to you. I know you had the opportunity to attend our youth event just last week. And so thoughts from you on opportunities to access economic support, scale up projects, and perhaps some of the learnings that came from that event.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm so excited to share this platform with you, and looking forward to contributing as well. So basically, from the perspective of what has worked for my team and I in Nigeria to implement our projects and also promote the adoption of these nature-based solutions in communities that we work with. And that's first one, our major connection to the communities. As young people, which I believe has also worked for many other young people from across the globe, the fact that our population puts us everywhere, and we have an understanding of what is really obtainable in these local communities, and as such, we are able to adapt the solutions, the interventions we take into these communities to how best they can be adopted, and that has largely influenced and adoption. And for one, young people across the globe nowadays are motivated by something other than our fear that the livable future we desire might not be achievable. This time around, we are motivated by something stronger. We are motivated by our hope, the hope that the livable future we achieve, we desire for livelihood, where nature and human can coexist in harmony, is actually possible. But of course, we need to commit to taking urgent and deliberate actions, and that's why we are acting. And our population has also helped us with this, putting us everywhere in the community, and as such, we're able to understand how to better localize these solutions. A couple of days back, Youth for Nature, in partnership with Giving Mexico, they organized an event on youth leadership, on nature-based solutions for adaptation, and on behalf of the government of Canada and government of Mexico. And a lot of amazing initiatives were shared and interesting conversation. But most times it seems what we have as young people is our population, our passion, our technological advantage, and then our understanding of what the solutions are, and then the motivation to secure our future. But oftentimes it seems this is all we have. The enabling environments are not always there, and that's speaking of the funding. Of course, funding to do what we do much better, to connect with these communities, understand what the problems are, and how best to address it. We have these solutions, but we are limited by the resources to make this happen. We're limited by the resources to compensate us for our time and commitment, and we are limited by access to opportunities to better learn more on what we do. And this is what we really need for older generations, to trust us more, that when we say we know what the solutions are, we know what we are doing, we are already implementing these solutions, but we need this support to do more. We don't want to be forced to choose between what we're passionate about and then having to survive.
Absolutely.
We want funding to help do this much better. Thank you so much. Back to you, Elizabeth. Yeah.
Thank you, Opeyemi, and we're going to come back to ask you more about the work that you've done and partners that you've worked with. I do want to shift to Deputy Grand Chief Gull. Same question. What do you think can be done to help build economic support and scale up impact of nature-based solutions in the communities that you've worked in and in your community locally?
I think for us, one of the biggest barriers that we were able to overcome was really investing in data gathering processes. We have 10 communities, in between the most northern and most southern is a 10-hour car ride. Really being able to develop local level relationships and giving them the tools to gather data was one of the biggest barriers that we faced, but was also one of the biggest barriers that we were able to overcome with financing. And I just want to highlight, when Ms. Anderson spoke, she said, protect, manage, and restore the land to address social challenges. When you want to do that, it's not only about protecting the land, it's empowering the people, it's about building capacity, it's about building knowledge and ensuring that the relationship that they have with the territory can be captured and reflected through various data gathering tools. So I cannot begin to stress enough the importance of ensuring that they're able to have not only computer programming, but financial support to ensure that they can travel or meet or highlight focus groups. It's really, really important. Our key partners were governments, private sectors. We had many charities and foundations helping us work on this project. And with that type of financing, we were really able to invest in ensuring that the data that we collect not only helped our project, but helped the community also. And the tools that we left behind helped them grow the knowledge within their local community as well.
Fantastic. I want to give Mr. Regino Montes an opportunity as well to respond to this question. Again, what do you think can be done to help access more economic support to scale up and grow the impacts of nature-based solutions in your communities? Mr. Regino Montes, thoughts on how to attract the resources needed to scale up solutions?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. For us, within the government of Mexico, there's a very important role to be played by the indigenous peoples and communities themselves. They need to reinforce their own cooperation mechanisms and their own funding mechanisms. In Oaxaca, in the south of Mexico, we've got the TechGeo instrument, and this is collective work, and that allows us to generate a whole series of different initiatives that covers all areas of daily life. I also want to highlight the fundamental role of national and subnational governments. It's very important for governments globally to take action on programs and specific resources to further reinforce these Indigenous peoples-led initiatives for nature-based solutions. And finally, the international community has to also strengthen the funding mechanisms on this matter, because we've got this global change of climate change, and this is a challenge that we need to cover in all areas and at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to move to Mr. Niebuhr. Hank, thanks for joining us. Same question to you. What do you think can be done to better access economic support to scale the impacts of nature-based solutions in your communities?
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everybody, for having me here. Good morning, good afternoon. Well, there is an enormous amount of finance available worldwide for infrastructure. The people responsible for managing this finance should ask themselves a question: what kind of society do you want? And decide which kind of solutions for challenges you would like to see in this society. Monofunctional solutions addressing the main problem while creating adverse side effects, or multifunctional, system-based and multidimensional solutions which solve the main problem while creating benefits for many stakeholders, including local communities and the environment? Seems to me an easy question. If you have answered that, what you can do is put the resources that they have where their ambitions are. Invest in leveraging consortia, including local and indigenous leaders, to support the development of nature-based solutions demonstration projects. Use these projects to inspire bottom-up action, and in each country enable work towards broader adaptation of nature-based solutions through in-country replication. And complement that by investment in programs that enable capacity building, awareness raising, institutional embedding and knowledge development. And exchange and mobilize the further resources and coordinate that at a regional level. And use these resources to address barriers to replication and upscaling at regional and national levels. And we have an example of how this could work. You will find it in the cinema, and there is a side event called Accelerating Adaptation Through Building with Nature. And please join us if you see an opportunity to work with us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Niebuhr. Okay, as we move now to focus on local action for nature-based solutions, I just invite the audience to please join me in thanking Mr. Regino Montes, Deputy Grand Chief Gull, and Ms. Malinke for their insights on this important conversation. The opportunity that all solutions should be based in nature, such a strong message, and the opportunity to learn from and put into practice learnings from Indigenous leaders, absolutely critical. So thank you all for joining us. We're honored to have had you on screen with us today. And so it's now my pleasure to turn to our local leaders. Before I do that, I do just want to remind the audience that you may want to toggle off your chat as you're watching the video. I understand it can create some choppiness in your feed. So as you're focusing on the video, if you want to toggle off the chat, and then if you want to add something to the chat, and of course we encourage you to do so, go ahead and do that. Okay, Mr. Elugilo and Mr. Niebuhr, let me start with you, Opeyemi. You've done a great deal of work to raise awareness and build capacity among farmers to implement nature-based solutions through agroecological farming practices in Nigeria. So I'd love to hear from you. What were the most important collaborations that helped you to mobilize that local action? And what do you think could be done to help you scale up action even further?
Thank you so much again, Elizabeth. Happy to be here again. Yeah, so basically what has worked and helped us, just to reiterate again, is the connection to these stakeholders, targeted stakeholders for our projects. The fact that we are on the ground and then we understand how the problem, how they are facing the challenges, how they have been affected. And this helps to align the solutions to their needs and what they really want. So the major stakeholders that we've been working with are local farmers and young people here in Nigeria. When you connected to the local community, you understand that farmers do want to adopt organic farming approach, but the cost of organic fertilizer can be high. So, you know, the intervention either to increase and make these organic fertilizers available to them, or you build their capacity on how to produce this organic fertilizer from readily available waste. You know, the same thing for agroforestry. The major challenge is access to indigenous food seedlings and, you know, to either make this available to build their capacity on harvesting these indigenous seeds and then start having their own nurseries. Same thing for conservation. You know that communities that live in association with these forest communities, it's not that they don't really want to conserve these natural resources, but the mutual exclusivity between conservation and livelihood has been a major challenge. So having this understanding helps to design the intervention in ways that they can easily adopt. And like I mentioned earlier, having this lasting relationship with the farmers really helps. And one of our main current projects now are called Farm to Farm Dialogue. Is meant to connect with farmers in their communities to understand what their hope and aspiration for the future of food and farming is, and how we can help them achieve just transition. So this is our way of building this lasting relationship with these farming communities and to better prepare for the intervention that will be bring it to them. And this project is in partnership with Norwich, Scotland, who are the major hosts of the project. So basically what we need now is actually the enabling environment to keep making this happen, the funding to do what we do better, to make these resources that would help the farming community to adopt this agroecological farming more, and also to help the forest-dependent community to give them an alternative means of livelihood to ensure that conservation is effective and they really adopt these nature-based solutions that, of course, it's essentially our livelihood is tied to nature, and we have no other option than to make this happen. But we do need resources to keep up with what we're doing, to compensate for our time, to do this intervention more at the community level, and access to capacity building fellowships, training programs to further strengthen our understanding of the solution as well as the problem. Thank you so much. Back to you, Elizabeth.
What a rich answer, Opeyemi. Thank you for that. Mr. Niebuhr, what about yourself? What were the most important collaborations that helped EcoShape, which is a foundation I understand that manages nature-based solutions pilot projects around the world, to mobilize action in local communities?
Yes, Elizabeth, thank you. Well, yes, I represent EcoShape, indeed, which is a foundation in the Netherlands that carries out the public-private innovation program Building with Nature. And Building with Nature is a process to create, implement and scale up nature-based solutions in the water sector. And with our partners, which are NGOs, Knowledge Institute, construction and engineering companies, we have realized over 14 physical nature-based solutions projects, which you can see, where you can go to and which you can experience. And what we have learned there, we have translated into guidelines for replication and scaling up, which are open for everybody to use via our website. So we offer our experience and cooperation model to the adaptation community as a source of knowledge and inspiration for the Adaptation Agenda that was adopted this afternoon at the summit. Well, some examples of our work have been, in Indonesia, we built a program for reducing coastal erosion and revitalizing a coastal aquaculture-based economy. This was a multidisciplinary effort undertaken by the government of Indonesia, Wetlands International and EcoShape. We built salt marshes in the Netherlands to improve flood protection while delivering important services to the local ecosystem and the health and well-being of the local population. All the concepts we worked on, and which you can find on our website and in the book we launched today at the CAS, are applicable in climate adaptation and will contribute to achieving the SDGs. Leadership has been vital to the success of our projects. Leadership at the companies who had the foresight to start the program 12 years ago, when they felt that the traditional way of working will not solve the planet's challenges. And local leadership by public authorities who embraced and supported our program because they recognized the added value for society. Leadership in communities where we worked in, by individual community members, local civil society organizations, and local scientists, mayors, and inspired civil servants. In Indonesia, for instance, community groups were set up, led by local leaders to construct and maintain permeable structures offshore to stimulate sedimentation to enable mangrove recovery. With these communities, we reconverted degraded and abandoned fish ponds into mangrove area along the coast and rivers, creating space for floodplains and mangrove formation. Last but not least, we worked with community leaders to introduce sustainable aquaculture practices with which individual smallholders were able to raise their income at less environmental costs. Realizing nature-based solutions at a landscape scale requires that you work on multiple levels of governance and make sure that everybody works for the same objectives. This will not happen by itself, and it requires leadership. As I said before, we have a plan to upscale adaptation through nature-based solutions in Asia. This plan is led by Wetlands International, and we kindly invite partners and donors to join and support this initiative. Local and indigenous leadership will again be one of the key pillars building on our experience thus far. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. Such rich answers from both of you in terms of the opportunity to really partner at the local level, whether it be to focus on mangrove, whether it be working with local farmers, just incredible applications of some of the principles we've heard thus far. So I know the audience will join me now in thanking again both Mr. Elujalo and Mr. Nibor, Opiemi and Hank for joining us today and sharing your perspectives. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you again soon. So it's now my pleasure to welcome two distinguished speakers who will help set the scene for the next portion of our agenda, which will focus on financing of nature-based solutions and the real need for leadership from both the public and the private sectors in that area. We're so fortunate to have joining us today the Honourable Karina Gould, Minister of International Development for the Government of Canada, who I know is incredibly passionate about both public service and international development. And of course, joining her on screen, none other than Dr. Andrew Steer, CEO and chairperson of the World Resources Institute. And so now over to you, Dr. Steer, to kick off this part of agenda.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and let me add my word of welcome to this very exciting event and our gratitude to Canada and Mexico for making it happen. It's been an exciting task over the last 2 years for us at the World Resources Institute to be a co-managing partner of the Global Commission on Adaptation, and we've learned so much. And the exciting things we've heard just in the last half hour are remarkable. All around the world, there are extraordinary experiments, pilots, and even things happening at scale on nature-based solutions. But what we're discussing in this part of the event is what about the financing? Whilst there are amazing opportunities, the financing is not yet where it needs to be, quite frankly. The great thing about nature-based solutions, obviously, is that it addresses both the mitigation side and the adaptation side. So it has incredible impact on climate change, bringing down carbon from the atmosphere in the form of trees and bushes and soils and crops, enriches the livelihoods of farmers all around the world. It protects water, it protects flooding, it even protects sort of heat islands in cities. And yet, we are not yet seeing the investment that we need to see in nature-based solutions. So I'd like to actually turn to the Minister of Development Cooperation of Canada to ask her a few questions, because Canada is really struggling with this issue and doing a very, very good job in terms of trying to figure out how do we get more public financing internationally to support this. Around the world, developing countries are increasingly spending more money, and developed countries are spending money on their own investments. And we're seeing some real sort of shifts towards nature-based solutions. But a recent analysis that we did in the World Resources Institute for the Global Commission essentially showed that that actually perhaps only 1% to 2% of international funding for climate goes to nature-based solutions. And if you look at all international financing for climate, perhaps it's more like 7%, much too small, quite frankly, given the incredible impact it can have. And at a time when the world is recovering, we hope, from COVID, at a time when we are trying to reboot our economy, the world is going to spend between 10 and 20 trillion dollars in trying to reboot the world economy. The best possible source of jobs quickly is through nature-based solutions. And Canada has been doing a great job. So, Minister Karina Gold, it's been a pleasure working with your government, working with, for example, Ambassador Patricia Fuller over the last 2 years. Also been a pleasure working with the Mexican government, Martha Delgado and people like that. But as Minister of Development Cooperation, you are doing some really interesting things. Tell us what you're learning and what's happening.
Yeah, well, first of all, Dr. Shear, it's such a pleasure to be with you this morning, and thank you so much, to everyone involved for organizing this event. I have to say that I have been looking forward to this for quite some time because there is nothing that gets me quite as excited about international development as climate financing and nature-based solutions. And I think that, as you rightly pointed out, as we are looking to recover and rebuild following the COVID pandemic, our attention should rightly turn to fighting climate change. And I think one of the issues has been is that for too long, we've really separated the conversation of fighting climate change and protecting nature. And actually, we need to see them as one and the same. And so I was really pleased that the Prime Minister announced, just 2 weeks ago, our $55 million contribution to the LDNF fund, which is really trying to ensure that we are protecting nature, fighting climate change, and building livelihoods into it in the process. And I think that's part of it as well, is that, what we all need to be doing both domestically and internationally is recognizing how important nature is for not just fighting climate change, but also for much of our economy and much of the livelihoods and jobs that make our economy go, and the trade that we all do. And so bringing the private sector into that is really important. But I think, and what Canada thinks, is that, by making these investments like the $55 million in the LDNF fund is a way to catalyze other investments. Because when you put public resources in, you kind of provide a bit of a stamp of, this is something that we think can work. And so how do we crowd in additional resources is going to be really, really important.
Well said, and thank you again for your leadership. When we were sort of looking at this issue as to why is development finance not adequately going in this area, there are a number of sort of constraints, if you like. One was sort of being able to understand it. I mean, everybody can understand, a solar plant, or a wastewater plant, or even concrete to protect floods, that form of adaptation. But when it comes to nature-based solutions, they're a little more complicated. How do you disperse the money? Who does it? It has to be community-driven. It's all a little bit more complicated. And so one of the things we're most impressed about the way what you're doing about it is trying to build capacity internally and then trying to engage internationally. And my question for you, this year, we've got lots of opportunities to move this agenda forward. We've got the first ever UN Food Summit. Mm-hmm. We've got G7 will put this on the agenda. You will be there. G20 is going to put this on the agenda. Then you've obviously got the Biodiversity Convention. You've got possibly an Ocean Summit. You've got then, of course, COP26, and it's one of the big themes there. Tell us about how Canada, sort of what's your strategy as you approach these meetings? Because I think you have a very, very important leadership role to play.
Well, I think part of it is really recognizing that we can't separate nature and climate, and we also can't separate that from, economic recovery. And if I can, be so bold, I think that COVID-19 in many ways has provided us a window into what the climate catastrophe could look like, how disrupted our lives have been this past year, and the scale of disruption that we could and devastation that we could see. And there's I'm sure some of you who are watching have maybe seen this cartoon. There's a series of waves, right? You have the COVID-19 pandemic, and then you have the climate crisis coming, and then you have the collapse of biodiversity. And so for me, that just puts it so clearly as to why we have to drive this agenda forward and truly understand how interconnected we are. We heard, you're talking about solar energy or, a concrete barrier to prevent flooding, but we actually know how important wetlands are, right? We know how important mangroves are. And, so much of that is also tied into local community traditions and history and connection to the land, and how are we engaging? And you talked about it's more complicated, but often things that are more complicated are probably done a bit better, right? If it's a simple solution, we probably miss something along the way. And so we're trying with our Feminist International Assistance Policy, when we're looking at our climate financing, how are we doing community engagement? How are we tying in gender equality and marginalized groups? How are we building buy-in from communities for the kinds of solutions that we know we need, not just from a climate perspective, a biodiversity perspective, but also from an inclusion and an economic perspective? You talked a little bit about food security, right? Food security and the Food Systems Summit is going to have such a huge role to play in talking about why nature-based solutions are important, why it's important for more sustainable agricultural practices, not just to protect the environment, but also to protect and promote human health.
Yeah, well, very well said. And I think the as we've just heard in the last half an hour, the people that are best equipped to actually implement such programs are people closest to the ground. And that traditionally has actually been quite hard. I used to work at the World Bank for many years. It's quite hard, actually, for international development agencies to get money close to the ground, partly because it sort of seems riskier. And I think we are going to have to trust more. And I think the most effective development agencies will be those that actually are able to take that plunge. I mean, there's another track under the Adaptation Commission on what's called locally based solutions. And it turns out that only 1 to 5% of all the funding for climate actually goes down to the local level. And I think you in Canada are doing some really interesting issues. And there's the local issue to think about, but increasingly now there's going to be working with the private sector, which you're doing as well. And the private sector at the moment, the corporate sector, has potentially a lot of money they want to put in nature-based solutions, because some of them, of course, have made commitments to net zero, and they'd like to net out their own obligations. That could be risky, quite frankly, unless governments get engaged. And so we both have the local, but then also engaging in the now we're just reaching the end of our time. I've just been told by the organizer. So the final word is yours, Minister, and it really is great talking to you.
Well, it's been so great. And I think both of us could spend a lot more time talking about this because it is such an exciting topic. But I think what's really important is that, we make sure that we set those parameters and that we're being both climate smart and nature positive and community inclusive. And so that really has to be the guiding principles for us to make sure that as we implement nature-based solutions, we're dealing with mitigation and adaptation, but we're bringing communities along so that they carry on the practices and that they have ownership of those solutions as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Minister Gould and Dr. Steer, for your perspectives and insights. And, I note that you both talked about the importance of both public and private financing working together to drive those jobs, as well as the social benefits, environmental benefits. And it's exciting to note that we have represented here on the line, watching the call, watching the video feed, many representatives from private sector, international organizations, government, NGOs, think tanks, academia. So from responses to that previous poll, everybody's on the line that we need here to take action. So thank you for your words. And I'll just encourage everybody, keep using the chat to talk about what you're doing at home. And on that note, I am going to shift now to our next poll question, which you'll see coming up on screen. And that's to ask you, what do you think is needed to scale up the implementation of nature-based solutions? So you in the audience from around the world, from multiple sectors and backgrounds, let us know what you think is critical to scaling up the implementation of those nature-based solutions projects. Now, as Minister Gould and Dr. Steer discussed, we know that an important element of scaling nature-based solutions, of course, is attracting capital. How can we best overcome investment barriers and mobilize increased public and private financing? As you've heard from our speakers, this was a key focus for the action track over the last year. And in fact, the action track led to the identification of 3 challenges to be overcome. First, the need to build a better understanding of the business case for investing in nature-based solutions. Second, the need to obtain and use climate information for motivating and focusing private investment. And third, the need to create the enabling conditions for private investment in adaptation, including incentives and blended finance to share risk. We now have the chance to take a look at a quick video highlighting some of the solutions that were identified by the action track that are already helping to address these challenges.
Hi, my name is Urs and I work at South Pole. We're just about to launch the Landscape Resilience Fund, which is a global adaptation fund that provides technical assistance and loans to small businesses. This means we engage with local communities to help them protect the landscape around them. We use data and models to analyze and predict extreme weather events to help vulnerable communities and farmers. What makes our fund unique is that we reinvest all repayments from loans to multiply our impact and expand our services to those who can't access banks. 2021 is a big year for the Landscape Resilience Fund. We're excited to empower local stakeholders and develop our first landscapes in Africa and Asia.
We see insurance as a key measure to enable investments in natural assets and enable green projects and infrastructure. Insuring nature the same way we cover other assets will help conserve and restore these assets. It will also support the feasibility of nature-based solutions. COVID-19 has taught us about the importance of having a comprehensive view on risks and being prepared for extreme events. So, as we look forward, we need to bring these lessons to bear and reinforce our climate adaptation strategies.
Aquafondo is a financial governance and management mechanism that integrates the relevant stakeholders of a basin to promote water security in the metropolitan area through conservation actions. This mainly addresses the challenge number 3 and transversally the challenge number 1 and 2. A Peruvian public policy has enabled the design, creation, and ongoing management of these and other water funds. A key factor that has made the creation of these and other water funds possible is a system of transparent investment of the funding received as donations or in administration.
At Finance for Impact, together with Aegis Engineering Group, we propose the idea of impact-linked blue bonds to finance blue economy projects. The innovation lies in that these bonds would be reimbursed through the sale of impact credits. These impact credits are credit notes, similar to carbon credits, but in this case, they're like tokens representing itemized contributions to nature-based solutions. So who would buy them? Greenfield project promoters and private donors in the voluntary market.
At Yapo Solutions, we work to make nature-based adaptation operational. We use climate, productive and economic data to build a business case and make it bankable for financial institutions as agents of change. Our digital platform can be applied globally. Its data is being managed and sourced locally. We thereby address 3 challenges of increasing the understanding of the business case for investing, using available data to drive private investments, and providing the enabling conditions for financing and risk transfer.
Wow, what a great representation of some of the work being done to overcome these critical challenges. We're so fortunate that we're able to actually have 3 leaders join us to dig deeper into this topic this morning or this afternoon or this evening, depending on when you're joining us or where you're joining us from. To start, I'd like to introduce Luisa Elena Guinan, Vice Minister of Strategic Development of Natural Resources of the Ministry of Environment at Peru. Also joining us this morning from Switzerland, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Veronica Scotti, Chairperson of Public Sector Solutions for Swiss Re. And finally, it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Bambang Susantono, Vice President for Knowledge Management and Sustainable Development for the Asian Development Bank, joining us from the Philippines. Thank you so much to all 3 of you for joining us. Maybe I'll start with Ms. Scotti. I wanted to ask you specifically, how can the insurance industry enable the scale-up of nature-based solutions?
Hi, Elizabeth, can you hear me?
I can hear you, thank you.
Fantastic. I've been following the discussion, so hopefully we'll build on the conversation we've had so far. There are 3 ways, I'll try to be quite structured. There are 3 ways I believe the industry can make a big difference in scaling up. First of all, it has all to do with risk and closing understanding and information gaps. So it's around enabling risk-sharing activity, risk-taking activities. And it's not different from what we do elsewhere. When it comes to nature-based solutions, we want to be able to demonstrate that we understand what are the risks to the projects, but we also understand the opportunities associated with the projects. And so by improving our assessment of those risks, we can then also facilitate mitigating actions. And by putting in place those mitigating actions, we can reduce the gap of information and the obstacles, remove the obstacles that prevent investors from participating in those risk-sharing and productive activities. So I think it is, in that sense, it's really important that we have these explicit ex-ante mechanisms because we can attract more investments because progressively we understand more. And there was a comment, I think, from Andrew Steer about the intransparency. So that's step number 1. Secondly, we, for the nature, based on the nature of what we do, which is indeed understanding the unknowns, if you will, we can really help develop common knowledge and common practices. And I think practices are so important here. We use a scientific method, we develop models, and so through our tools and our methods, making them available to a broader community of users, we can really help with resilience and adaptation. And thirdly, I think we can make a difference because as an industry that tends to look at the downside and things that happen at the tail, so where things all correlate. And I think the Minister Gold was speaking about, taking into consideration very different perspectives. We need to think in a system way. And we normally do that. It's the nature of our business. So when you think in systems, then you can think in system-based solutions. In that sense, in the same way as we today insure our properties, our assets, the things that we care for, we could and we should insure nature. And because, as we pointed out before, it provides, we're so dependent on it, whether it's the fresh water that we drink or the revenues from tourism that we earn. And that's why, as a company, already a year ago, we developed what we called a Biodiversity Ecoservices Index. And what this index allowed us to try and demonstrate is that closing that knowledge gap is that 55% of the global GDP is dependent on intact ecosystems. And if those ecosystems are not intact, and the minister explained this wave that is coming, immediately after climate, if we don't understand these interdependencies, then we put everything at risk. So our belief as an organization is that we need to create proof points that are positive so that we can help grow a much broader movement behind within the industry and beyond around appreciating more the value of the ecosystem. And that's why we work on examples. And if it's possible, I'd like to share with this group a couple of examples. So I have a first picture, which is a project that really tried to demonstrate the interdependency of nature and economy. And I hope the audience can see it. You should see some people in the picture. And what you will see there, it's Quintana Roo, which is on the coast of Mexico. And in 2017, we designed a cover to protect the coral reef, which is a beautiful natural asset. But it is also a very important measure, nature-provided measure, to prevent and mitigate the risks of the damages from storm surge. And what we do through this cover, what we did is pay out supporting restoration activities. So the cover in itself, it's kind of hitting on multiple dimensions. On the one hand, is protecting the tourism revenue that are really important to the region. Secondly, is empowering the communities that live in the region, because we also help fund the creation of what we call the Reef Brigades. And these are the individuals that go and collect the reefs and then restore it, because time is of the essence, so that it can regrow and continue to preserve both the revenues, but also the beauty of the region. And so this was put to test last year when the Hurricane Delta hit the region. And I think it's a case that can be replicated the world over, and we're attempting to do that. Another example, which is the second picture, this looks like an island maybe from the tropics, but actually it's Netherlands, and it's the island of Texel. And it's an example of how we're greening a critical infrastructure, which is a dike, right? So this is about using nature for landscaping and engineering purposes. And this, the intent was here to protect the dike against erosion. It's a very important thing. Otherwise, entire communities are at risk. Well, what we did in this context, together with the municipalities, is to move 5 billion cubic meters of sand and to plant 2 million marram grasses. And why does that matter? Because first of all, you get through nature and natural protection again against erosion. But secondly, this is the largest dike, the biggest dike reinforcement operations in the Netherlands, which is the biggest dike, expert in the world. And it is also a World Heritage Site. So I actually think it's a beautiful combination of many different dimensions coming together. And we provided a coverage that protects the physical assets, protects against the weather events, against the liabilities, and made it even more beautiful. We have over 1 million people visiting the island. We've helped through this intervention with additional benefits like fish production. And we also, saw an improvement in climate regulation, water quality regulation. So I think it's all for the better. We're absolutely convinced that this is the way to go. And that's why we have a global practice that is dedicated to replicating this type of initiatives around the world.
Fantastic. Thanks for those very real examples and beautiful photos. I want to shift now to Vice Minister Guinan. I'm hoping, Vice Minister, you could share with us what enabling conditions were needed to help mobilize financing for nature-based solutions for adaptation efforts in Peru.
First of all, thank you for this invitation. I'm here on behalf of Minister Gabriel Quijandría, and I'm happy to be here today as a vanguard country in this action track, nature-based solutions, before I answer your question. And basically, the enabling conditions in Peru, we are working on that together, the Ministry of Environment with the Ministry of Economy and Finance. And we have been developing different mechanisms to promote the recovery and conservation of natural ecosystems in the country. I will share with you 3 of these mechanisms. The first, the approval of the Framework Law on Climate Change and its regulation. This law enables sectoral authorities and regional governments to formulate and implement projects and programs that incorporate adaptation. Just to give you an idea, we have now 19 adaptation measures out of a total of 92 measures in adaptation in our current NDC that are related to nature-based solutions. So this gives the governments and the private sector a framework in which to start working. 19 of these measures are already related to nature-based solutions. The second mechanism is the approval of guidelines for the formulation of investment projects related to ecosystem, species, and support the sustainable use of biodiversity. These guidelines were also elaborated in coordination with the Ministry of Economy and Finance in 2019. The third mechanism is the approval of the law of remuneration mechanism for environmental services. This is known in Peru as MERECE. And this was approved in 2014, but then rules and regulations in 2016. And last week, we approved what we call the guidelines. So we are given the whole legal framework to work on this kind of project. As you see, are really related to the topic of nature-based solutions. I would like to share with you an example of what we're talking about when we say merece. For example, there is a current project developing with the coordination also with the International Fund for Agricultural Development. It's a project also with the funded by the Environmental Fund. And this project is, has the objective to conserve high Andean ecosystems of two basins, Jequetepeque and Cañete. And through the design and implementation of this kind of mechanisms, we are trying to manage to commit to the conservation and recovery of around 14,000 hectares of this type of ecosystem. And we're channeling a total of $5 million for these particular two basins that are Jequetepeque and Cañete. These are close to the city of Lima. And with that, I will close sharing with you three basic mechanisms and a particular example. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vice Minister. Mr. Susantono, from your vantage point, what role do you see for multilateral organizations such as the Asian Development Bank in mobilizing capital for nature-based solutions for adaptation?
Thank you, Elizabeth, and also thank you for inviting me in this very important event. I think the role of multilateral organizations should not be seen as limited to only mobilizing capital. At ADB, we believe that financing is necessary but not sufficient if we want to encourage more NBS for adaptations. There are at least three things that we at ADB can do. First, we use what we call programmatic loan or policy-based loan to reform or to change the regulatory framework, policies, and regulations, which creates enabling environment conducive to do more NBS. Second, ADB provides financing, as many of you know, for innovative NBS projects. They include direct financing and credit enhancement, along with other financial instruments such as the green bonds, blended finance, public-private partnership, and credit risk guarantees. So as you see here, the role of private investment is important to develop NBS. And third, through knowledge sharing and capacity building. For this, we are providing technical assistance to our member countries. At ADB, we consider NBS and eco-resilience are integral part of our actions for building resilience. So let me briefly highlight ADB's three key approaches to promote NBS. First, we promote good practice knowledge through capacity building for planning and designing infrastructure. For example, in Vietnam, ADB collaborated with UNDP to assist the government to develop climate-resilient road design standards with NBS. In Indonesia, we have an urban climate change resilient trust fund, and through this fund, we have trained people to operate and maintain community infrastructure which biologically treats contaminated and polluted water. Second, we are implementing projects with demonstration effects. NBS is increasingly being mainstreamed into our loans, grants, and technical assistance. For example, in the People's Republic of China, ADB is helping implement what we call sponge cities. These cities are intelligently planned to protect urban green spaces while also reducing flood risk and effectively managing water resources. In Vietnam, our project is combining bioengineering with traditional infrastructure to stabilize slopes and embankment. This approach has increased the resilience of local communities against natural hazards in the rural areas at risk. Third, we are developing risk transfer products and innovative risk financing solutions for NBS. For example, our Asia Pacific Climate Finance Fund is undertaking a mapping and assessment of possible risk transfer products and structures to support NBS. We are also developing the concept for PPPs for coral reef insurance in Asia and the Pacific. By providing coastal protections benefit to people and property, this project aims to bring in more financing opportunities to build climate resilience of coastal businesses, communities, and livelihoods. These projects cover Fiji, Indonesia, the Philippines, and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific. And the model will incorporate coral reef protections to reduce coastal erosion and storm-related flooding. So I stop here for further discussion.
Thank you so much, Mr. Susantono. A great intervention. So this event is intended to be action-oriented, as you know, and so I want to target a question to each of you about where we go from here. Now, we just have a few minutes left, so this is going to be all about the most critical action from each of you. If you could name one action in a minute or less, what do we do next to bring the public and private sectors together to finance ambitious nature-based solutions projects for adaptation? What is the most important action that we can take next? And Ms. Scotty, perhaps I'll start with you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I was going to mention three, but I'll go with one as per your instruction. So I think we need to lead with what are our unique core competencies. I think in the industry, we have this ability to assess risk and knowledge. We've part of the UNDP UNEP-led initiative on insurance SDGs. And we're very optimistic that in a matter of relatively short time, we'll come up with our own principles on how sustainability in general and nature-based solutions in particular will be permeating every decision we make, from investment to how we assess risks. And I think this is very transformative. The tool that I mentioned before, the index, it's something that we've integrated in our CatNet tool, which is used by 15,000 professionals in the industry globally. So by just making these little changes, integrating in our mainstream of activities, nature-based solutions, we can very quickly change the way the industry by and large can be participating in this dialogue.
Fantastic. Thank you for being able to pick one. I know it's a challenge. Vice Minister Ginan, I'd love to shift to you next. What is one action? What is the most critical thing we could do to bring the public and private sectors together to finance nature-based solutions projects?
A very important, interesting question, and I would refer to, in Peru particularly, not only to provide the framework, but to promote the conversations, necessary conversations between the different levels of government and the private sector. But when I say conversations, what we mean is for these two actors, key actors, to understand the details, for example, of the mechanisms. In Peru, we have, for example, what we call public-private associations and public works for tax deductions. These are particularly mechanisms already in place, but we need to take down to the very local people and governments how to work with these mechanisms in order to articulate the private work with the government. And we have some examples here in Peru. We have projects in the Amazonia, we have in the Andean Mountains, coastal marine ecosystems, and a project that is called Natural Infrastructure for Water Security. All these pilot projects are trying to work on that, articulating the local, very local governments with private sector. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vice Minister. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Susantono. Love to hear from you. What is the most important thing, the most important action we can take to bring together public and private sectors to finance ambitious nature-based solutions projects?
Yeah, it is important to recognize that NBS are a necessary complement to conventional hard engineering solutions. So combining green and green infrastructures offer a practical, cost-effective, and also sustainable way of addressing climate change. So it's very difficult to just mention one, but I just want to mention the keyword, but it has to be a holistic approach. There are 4 keywords. One is expanding the knowledge base, right? And second is enabling policy environment. Third one is financial structuring and innovative financings. And lastly, it's also a very important one, is the capacity building, combining both local wisdom and advanced knowledge, especially for the local community. So I stop there.
Beautiful. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to meet you and have a chance to talk with you. I look forward to working with you again soon. And with that, I'm going to transition to the next portion of our agenda. And what an incredible event it's been so far. We've heard important learnings from Indigenous leaders. We've met impassioned and empowered young people. We've discovered the power of local action, the importance of political leadership, and the need to collaborate in order to scale solutions globally. We know that as we work together to restore our economies in the face of the COVID pandemic and to combat the impacts of climate change, nature is and has to be one of our greatest allies. In reading through the chat and the questions that you've been asking over the last hour, it's incredible to see the commitment that so many of you have to taking action to advance and accelerate nature-based solutions. And the latest poll that we ran shows that although the majority of you do believe that funding is the most critical thing we need to implement and scale up nature-based solutions, as was mentioned from the last panelists, it's really we need everything. We need all the opportunities. We need better knowledge, data, and metrics to advance and scale nature-based solutions. We need increased expertise and know-how and technical knowledge. We need stronger collaboration from the local level all the way up to internationally. And we need strong policy and regulatory environments. So across the board, our participants on the line believe we need all of these aspects to really see nature-based solutions scaled and advanced. And so, as the final piece of our agenda today, I have the privilege of welcoming 2 leaders who I know will provide us with inspiration as we look towards the future. First, I'd like to introduce Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez is the CEO of the Global Environment Facility and is joining us from Costa Rica. Mr. Rodriguez, over to you.
Hi, Elizabeth. Hi, Anne-Marie, and really pleased to be here and participating today. And it's a great event, and a lot have been said that are extremely important. But just let me add a couple of things here, which is important because we need to really let the broader social, political community to understand the cost effectiveness in using nature as a way to adapt to climate change and build a stronger, resilient society. Last week, we probably all read Elon Musk's commitment to give a 100 million prize for the best carbon capture technology. Probably there's a lot of people running around, but I got some bad news because Mother Nature already won that prize. Even though they are thinking on climate mitigation, Mother Nature is extremely good, not only mitigating climate change, offsetting those emissions of carbon that are up there, but most importantly, Mother Nature gives us a very good service in keeping carbon stocks where we want it. We want them on the ground, we want them on the forest and the different ecosystems. So, I got a kind of a bad news for Elon Musk, and I hope that he can put an eye on what we are doing during this week in this Adaptation Summit, which is fabulous and great. And in this context, nature gives us, as I said, the possibility to deal with this triple threat of climate change, biodiversity crisis, and COVID that are devastating our livelihoods in our society. And we need to understand that the root cause driving this triple crisis is that nature and humans work totally disconnected. As a matter of fact, that there's a big conflict within how we produce and consume and the very elemental elements that support life in this planet. So we need to recognize that transforming economic system and aligning them with the natural systems is our most important task in the incoming decade. And as we approach the many different COPs from the multilateral environmental agreements where parties, nations are committed to high ambitions, we need to understand how do we mobilize in a very effective manner resources to mitigate and adapt to climate change in a very efficient manner. In this respect, I come from a country, Costa Rica is a very small country, who has invested a lot in creating innovative domestic financial mechanisms to cope with the climate, human well-being, and nature and biodiversity laws changes. Costa Rica has been through them, particularly a tax on fossil fuels, which I call the tropical carbon tax. It's a very different concept to the northern concept of the carbon tax. This is a tropical one. We deal with the market failure. We allocate resources to those owners of forests and tree plantations because the market is unable to recognize those services through a carbon tax that pays them at least the cost of opportunity of doing cattle ranching. And with that, Costa Rica has been able to not only stop deforestation, but double the size of the forest at the same time that the economy tripled. We're talking about a couple of decades. So restoring the landscape, becoming more resilient to climate change, investing in climate adaptation hasn't been in Costa Rica a burden for social and economic development. And I tend to believe that this is a very interesting lesson whereby Costa Rica has proved that ecosystem-based adaptation is a good approach. And it is good for the economy, it is good for the people, and it's good for nature. It's understanding how do we use nature in the best possible manners. And experiences are, good experiences are all over the planet, and we need to, scale them up. In this respect, the GF works trying to concentrate efforts in catalyzing by catalyzing the creation of an equity fund to invest in nature-based solutions with small companies. This fund is called the Landscape Resilient Fund. This equity fund is managed by the South Pole Group, and it is in its initial designs to support the GF at the broader level as we work in climate adaptation and mitigation in many of our different financial windows. Also, we need to build models for risk sharing with blended finance to crowd in private sector investment in nature-based climate adaptation through lines of credit from micro loans to smallholder farmers to invest in their climate resilience. And we need to strengthen methodologies for evaluation of nature-based infrastructure to facilitate decision-making. And here, ecosystem-based adaptation, investment on climate adaptation will help us also deal not just with the market failures, which is something big, we all recognize, but we need to deal with another thing that is probably not as visible as the global market failure, which is the institutional failure. We have organized our countries, our governments in agencies. Unfortunately, those agencies that work on silos, and the best example of how we need to break a silo is the relationship within ministries of environment and ministries of agriculture. We got a dysfunctional relationship within these agencies, and nature-based solution for adaptation, ecosystem-based adaptation is one of the most effective approaches for small farmers and the agricultural sector. So at the same time, we'll be dealing with those huge market failures, but also the institutional failure, which is a key element. So let me close by saying that today's event should not be seen as a closure of an action track, but as the beginning of a collaborative movement of nature-based action for our planet. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rodriguez, for your inspiring remarks. And now to cap off what has been an incredible 2 hours, it is my pleasure to introduce the Right Honourable Anne-Marie Trevelyan. Minister Trevelyan is the UK International Champion on Adaptation and Resilience for the COP26 presidency and Minister of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth. Minister, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's a privilege to be able to provide some closing remarks for what really has been an excellent session. Though it is difficult to follow Carlos's wonderful, exuberant passion for the challenges we have in nature-based solutions. And he's not wrong. God created the tree, and it really is one of the great carbon-based solutions that exists. But I like the challenge that Elon Musk has set, and I shall watch Carlos's view of what the outcome of that is going to be. I wanted to also add my thanks to the Netherlands for organising such an important summit, and to the organisers, the Global Centre on Adaptation, which is showing really critical leadership on this incredibly important agenda. Thank you also, Elizabeth, for guiding us through the insightful conversations we've enjoyed today. I think the interrelated global challenges of poverty, of climate change and biodiversity loss threaten our very existence. And yet, as we have heard today, by harnessing the power of nature, we can take on this triple challenge. We believe nature-based solutions could provide around a third of the most cost-effective solutions to climate change. What's more, nature is the foundation of our global economy. The World Economic Forum estimates that over half the world's GDP, $44 trillion, is reliant on ecosystems and their services. And yet, despite our dependence on nature and the huge potential of nature-based solutions, it is estimated that they attract only 3% of global climate finance. So that's why the UK has chosen to put nature at the heart of our climate ambitions, both domestically and internationally. So when the UK hosts the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, in November, with our partners, we will be seeking to increase both ambition and financing for adaptation, resilience, and those nature-based solutions. At the One Planet Summit earlier this month, the UK committed to spending at least £3 billion of our international climate finance on climate change solutions that protect and restore nature and biodiversity over the next 5 years. This commitment recognises that healthy ecosystems are vital to the resilience of our communities and that nature-based solutions are an important instrument for both adaptation and mitigation. So in support of this agenda, the Race to Resilience, the new initiative by our UN Climate Champions team, aims to catalyse the actions of cities, businesses and civil society to build the resilience of 4 billion people in vulnerable groups by 2030. And the UK's announcement today of a new Adaptation Action Coalition with its partners will catalyse the action of governments around the world that are showing leadership, ambition and action on adaptation. At last week's Gobashona conference, I was pleased to announce the new Adaptation Research Alliance, which will focus on turning climate science into practical action. The huge importance of nature for building resilience is at the heart of the Leaders' Pledge for Nature. So I'm delighted that over 80 other countries have already joined us in signing. The pledge explicitly commits signatories to strengthen climate resilience in our economies and in our ecosystems. And I look forward to working with our fellow signatories and all of you here today to make this commitment a reality. COP26 will be a pivotal moment for the world to come together and agree ambitious steps to prevent the catastrophic warming of our planet and to build resilience to the impacts that are already locked in. So over the next year, we must make it count. This is our opportunity to make meaningful and lasting progress to protect our environment, our communities, and our livelihoods. And I look forward so much to working with all of you to achieve this. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Minister Trevelyan. Absolutely inspiring words. And thank you so much to everyone who joined our program today. Such an incredible lineup of speakers, leaders, and folks that are absolutely keen and committed to moving forward nature-based solutions for adaptation. I hope that you're feeling as inspired as I am about the potential to scale nature-based solutions for adaptation. The COVID pandemic pandemic has absolutely given us a window into what climate disaster could look like. And what we've heard today inspires me and motivates me to know that nature absolutely is our greatest ally, and the opportunity both to address mitigation as well as adaptation through nature. Love that call to Mr. Elon Musk, that if you want to find carbon capture solutions, nature is your best opportunity both to mitigate and to adapt to the effects of climate change, which we heard so critically today does not affect everyone equally. There are populations and groups of individuals around the world that will feel those impacts of climate change much more strongly than others of us. And so even more critical that we find ways to come together, both at the local level all the way to the international level, to scale up opportunities to work with nature as our ally and move forward. I hope that you've had an opportunity to attend some of the other sessions that have been part of the 2021 Climate Adaptation Summit. I want to add my thanks to the Netherlands, to the Global Commission on Adaptation, of course, to the governments of Canada and Mexico, the co-leads of the Nature-Based Solutions Action Track, for putting on this wonderful event, this 2-hour anchoring event, and for giving me the opportunity to be a part of it. And of course, thank you to the so many other partners that were a part of putting on this session. Finally, thank you to you for joining us from your homes, from your offices, from multiple time zones all around the world. It's been a thrill to spend the last 2 hours with you. Once again, I'm Elizabeth Schurt. I'm Managing Director of Globe Series. Wherever you've joined us from today, I just encourage you to stay safe, stay positive, and stay hopeful, and have a wonderful rest of your day.